with Guillaume Roux. So we are recording Guillaume. And so Guillaume comes from my lab, the LPTMS. And so Guillaume, you will have 1 hour and a half. And we'll interrupt you if we have questions on the chat, but also the students can ask directly if they want to you. Okay, you can start.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for following this lecture. So contrary to the title, I will talk only about the distribution of ratio of consecutive level spacing. It was a bit too ambitious to talk about something else, and we'll go in depth through the calculation of this. I will give you the PDF of my notes, and there will be some hyperlinks in blue for all the reference if you want to have direct access to the papers I'm citing. Okay, so the goal of today is what? Is to present some result that is a tool which is useful in the context of level statistics. So the idea of today is to discuss this and to show this result. So what is this result? It's about looking at the statistics of the energy level. So consider you have computed some or get some from the experiment some energy spectrum, lambda n. This will be the notation for all eigenvalues in what follows. And then you compute the spacing between two consecutive eigenvalues that we call Sn. And then you take the ratio between two of these consecutive spacings, which defines a variable Rn. So this can be viewed as a random variable. It has a certain distribution that you can compute using an histogram. And this probability distribution is denoted by P of R. And we are going to show that for random matrix ensemble, which are models that are pretty often used to compare with actual Hamiltonian's prediction, you get the following surmise, which is what we will call later Wigner surmise, so we'll do double. So you see it's a very simple power law that depends on an exponent which is beta, and beta depends on the matrix ensemble you work with. So we'll get beta equal 1, 2, or 4, depending on the matrix ensemble. So the goal of today is to explain this and also the context and why is it useful. Okay, and here on the right is the plot of this typical distribution, and we are going to get the analytical curve for that. So why is it useful? It was first introduced, to my knowledge, in the context of many-body localization in a seminal paper by Hogan Estienne and Hughes, this PRB 2007, where the two authors discussed a disordered Fermion model using spectral statistics and trying to infer a transition from a chaotic phase, which is unlocalized, to a localized phase, which has Poissonian, as we are going to discuss, a statistic. So here is what they did, and that's some numerics for this distribution P of R, and they're trying to follow with the size and with the disorder in their model, the behavior of the average of the variable little r. So this is an observable which is quite often used now in the literature to track the transition from chaotic to integrable limit. And what is interesting is that this was not the goal of their paper to introduce the P of R distribution, but they just did a footnote explaining a bit why they used this variable. So basically, they're saying that usually you rather work with a distribution which is P of S, where you need to normalize the local average gap. So the gap is the spacing. It's the same as the S variable. And they found that it did not work well with their model, and they decided to take this ratio to get rid of these local averages. So these local averages are actually related to the local density of states, and this is what we are going to see later on. Why do we need to introduce this local averaging, and why the P of R gets rid of it? Later, it was reused, for instance, as one of the many observable to study the many-body localization. So there is this famous paper by some lecturer and organizer here, where you switch from ergodic to many-body localized phase, and you see there are several observables, and one of them is this little r that is tracked here as a function of disorder again, between two limits. So you see a limit where the average is about 0.5, which is chaotic or GOE, and one where it's integrable, which is Poisson. And you see the role of using some finite size scaling to get some reliable data. Okay, so we are going to introduce the general context of level statistics. Then the result of random matrix theory, which is essentially some mathematics, and then some practical consideration about how to use it and so on. So for this lecture, I've used the following reference mainly, but there are many literature on the random matrix theory and quantum chaos, and you take the one that you prefer, but this one at least will be close to what I'm discussing. So historically, the situation was the following. In the 50s, people did some nuclear experiments, sending neutrons on nucleus, and they look at the resonances. And these resonances basically probe the spectrum of the nucleus. And when you look at the spectrum, it's a big mess. So what can you say to model this complex system? Well, Wigner said that one of the basic theoretical approach is always to look at simple as you can. And he was saying that basically in a simple-minded fashion, the question is simply what is the distance of the characteristic value of a symmetric matrix with random coefficients. So this is the Wigner surmise, and basically saying that the best way to compare the spacing of this neutron is to compare it with a random matrix. But of course, you can have different type of random matrix. So it just took some symmetric one because you're working with Hermitian matrices. And in order to get some analytics curve, he did a 2x2 matrix. And it actually works pretty well with the experiment. So here is an actual experiment and the comparison between the spacing and the Wigner surmise. So the first goal of this lecture will be to discuss a bit this Wigner surmise. So that's a critical plot in the field of level statistics. The idea is the following. The density of states usually is not universal, and you cannot really compare a density of state between two different Hamiltonians. It makes no sense. But Wigner realized, and it was not obvious that it worked, that fluctuation, which can be viewed at the distribution of the spacing, are actually more universal. So if you look at this quantity, you generically have two situations. Either you have independent level, which correspond to a Poisson level, and we are going to derive this orange curve, which is a simple exponential. Or you can have the Wigner surmise curve, which shows some level repulsion. What does it mean? It means simply that it's very little probable to have a spacing, so two adjacent eigenvalues that are very close to one another. And then you have a maximum because then very large gap are little probable as well. So you have a strong difference between these two predictions. And actually, what is the connection with the physics and the quantum chaos? This is the origin of the BGS conjecture, which is famous at LPTMS because these were members of the lab, and which states the following. So there was a big activity on quantum chaos starting in the 70s. And there was first a Berry-Tabor conjecture saying that whenever you have an integrable model, mostly with a semi-classical picture, there will be no level repulsion. So you have kind of independent spectrum levels, and then you get a Poissonian distribution. Later on, BGS proposed that, so that's the claim, spectra that are time reversal invariant Hamiltonians, so consider basic Hermitian Hamiltonians, whose classical analog are K-system. K-system means it's a certain type of chaotic system, show the same fluctuations as GOE. GOE is an ensemble of random matrices. So what they have in mind is the following. Wigner was insisting on the complexity of the Hamiltonian, so large matrix with a complicated structure. Here they insist on chaotic system. So by chaotic system, it's not necessarily that you have a very complicated system in terms of defining the equation and the degrees of freedom. It's rather a system in which you have a chaotic dynamics. And this can be simple systems, like simple quantum system, with a classical limit, for which you have a chaotic behavior. So they insisted on the fact that GOE, or random matrices, were associated to chaos, while integrability was associated to Poisson. And the system they took at the time was rather billiard, so single particle physics on billiard that could be a bit weird in terms of geometry. So essentially, the Hamiltonian, then it's a Laplacian, and you play with the boundary to make it chaotic or not. And the conjecture, which still is today of actuality, is to say that you associate integrability to Poisson statistic and chaotic to random matrix statistics. So somehow chaos matters more than complexity, but of course for very large complex system, chaos is more probable. So there is no proof of this conjecture, but you have supporting arguments based on non-linear sigma model and trace formula. And for a very good introduction, I recommend that you read the Denis Hulmeau review on Scholarpedia on this. And mostly, then the work is numerical, where people showed that you have a lot of numerical evidence showing that it is actually correct from few body models, kicked rotors and equilibrium physics also, to many body model. And typically here is the result for billiard, where you see the GOE statistic that is working. Here for the school and for our work and for later on, we mainly focused on many-body lattice model. So it was more difficult than billiard at the beginning because you have this exponential growth of the Hilbert space with the number of particles. But somehow people try it from the beginning almost because also of nuclear physics. So in this context, what do we call an integrable or Poisson-like model when you most of the time have no classical analog for the Hamiltonian? Well, the idea is that if you have an underlying block diagonal structure, it will prevent ergodicity of the level. So you need to have a sort of a block diagonal structure which can come from an infinite number of conserved quantities. Typically for model, if you think of 1D, that are beta and Zast integrable. You can have also the classical limit if your Hamiltonian is strongly dominated by diagonal elements, then you are usually close to Poisson. And you also have the free particle limit, where somehow you have a loss of ergodicity between the matrix element. So this is a bit by experience. You usually find a Poisson-like behavior whenever you have one of these three categories of model. And a seminal example was given by a series of 2 papers by these people in 1993, where in this example, they studied several models, but one of them was the Hubbard model in 1 dimension, where you have hopping of fermions and local on-site repulsion, plus additional next nearest neighbor repulsion. If you have V equal to 0, then the model is beta and Zast integrable. And you see, when of course you have get rid of all the lattice symmetries, within a diagonal block, you see a nice Poissonian behavior for the level statistic. While if you add a little bit of V, here it's for V equal 4, you see that it changes toward a chaotic behavior. So we need to understand random matrices and to understand the prediction of random matrices. So random matrices are mathematical objects that combines linear algebra and probability theory. And you can say a lot about this, and we're going simply to focus on the P of S and P of R curve. So basically, you draw elements at random according to some law, and depending the way you draw elements and the symmetry properties of the matrix, you can have various ensemble. So the matrix ensemble are meant because you have an ensemble average associated to the statistics. You have a lot of them, and here we are going to discuss the Wigner-Dyson one. The nice thing is that for many of them, you have a lot of mathematical results and tractable techniques, so this makes them as useful models because you have nice predictions. And it has been applied in many physical systems and also away from physics for the energy spectra, quantum chaos, but also Anderson localization and today's string theory and things that I don't understand. So it's a very popular field both in mathematics and physics. So the goal of today's lecture is also to give you an introduction on this. We are going to discuss the Wigner-Dyson ensemble, which are also called the beta ensemble because of this beta number. And the motivation is this connection between KO and level statistics. So how do we classify this Wigner ensemble? So there is a Lehman classification which states the following. You take a square n by n matrix in order to get real eigenvalues for your energies, and you take a distribution for the elements Hij of the matrix. So that will be called this distribution rho of H. And the way you draw these elements will ensure some properties of your statistics. So there are two main characteristics for this classification. To make things easy, usually you'd like to draw independent entries. So these are called the Wigner matrices, where you basically have independent way of choosing the entries. That's one thing. But another thing that you can require is that if you focus only on the eigenstates, the eigenvalues, you may not care much about the eigenstates. So you can require to have a rotational invariance of this probability density rho of H under all possible similarity transformation of your matrix space. So if you have this similarity transformation, you require that you have an invariance under this transformation. So usually you have the invariance of the element of volume from the similarity transform. So it boils down to having this property that rho of H is invariant under U. And there is a Weil lemma, which is a bit intuitive, which states that if you require rotational invariance, then your distribution should be a function of only the moments of H or the trace of H to some power. Okay, so this is the big circle with rotational invariance. And if you require both independent distributed entries and rotational invariance, there is actually only one possibility, which is the Gaussian ensemble here at the intersection between the two. And for this Gaussian ensemble, we are going to show quickly that necessarily the distribution is a Gaussian, which is a function of the trace of H square with some variance sigma square. Okay, so this is an important result, which is a lot constraining for the matrix. But since you have constrained a lot the form of the distribution and that it's a Gaussian, you may guess that you have a lot of analytical results that come with it. So practically, how you draw Gaussian random matrix? So you have three types of matrices that are square n by n. So I'm not doing the detailed discussion, which is based on general symmetry argument on time reversal and also total momentum constraint or not. So I recommend you to read the books by Hake for this detailed discussion. We are going to mostly focus on the simplest intuitive case, which are real symmetric matrix, if you have just real coefficient for your Hermitic Hamiltonian, or complex Hermitian matrix, which is when your Hamiltonian has some complex number. So here, the first type is GOE, the second term GUE, and the third type is complex symplectic symmetric, which for us will not matter so much. So we'll not discuss this, it has some specificity. So what can we say about this is that you can draw the element and you require real eigenvalues, so you require that the Hamiltonian is hermetic. The number of independent variables is important. So when you have a symmetric matrix, real, this is the number of independent variables, while if you have an Hermitian, it's a bit more because you have real and imaginary part for the off-diagonal elements. And this concerns then the element of your volume. When you have to integrate over the space of matrices, you will integrate over all possible elements, and there will be the element of volume of integration in each situation. When you mean that there is a similarity transform under which the rho of H is invariant, it means that you are using for real matrices orthogonal matrices for the transform, these O matrices, while you use unitary matrices for emission complex matrices. And of course, you know that you can diagonalize this matrix into a diagonal form where lambda will be the diagonal part of the Hamiltonian containing all the eigenvalues, and O will be some orthogonal or some unitary matrix here for the GUE. So this is just to give the big sketch of the classification. And practically, I will show you, if I have time, a small notebook showing you how to draw the matrices. So this comes with some important remarks. So first, when you require, and this is important for the physics, rotational invariance, what does it mean? It means that physically, you're saying that eigenvectors are not that relevant for the eigenvalue statistics, because if you change eigenvectors by doing a similarity transform, then you will not change the statistics of the eigenvalues. So it's actually a strong requirement, and you guess that it works with chaotic and not localized system. For usually localized system have some preference into some eigenvector basis that come with the localization. Okay, but it's a strong requirement, and of course, in general, eigenvectors do matter a little bit. So it's kind of an extreme limit here in this respect. Second thing is that when you want to draw numerically the matrix element, it's important to notice that there is a connection between the off-diagonal and diagonal variance of the laws of the elements. If you compute trace of h square, then you have a factor 2 that comes from the fact that for a symmetrical matrix, you will get twice the same number on the two elements, and you just sum over I smaller than j, and this will change the variance. You see that then when you put it in the exponential, you have a Gaussian with 2 sigma square for the diagonal part, but only sigma for the off-diagonal part. So if you want really to sample the random matrices, you have to be careful in taking Gaussians such that the off-diagonal is square root of 2 of the diagonal mean square. Okay, and lastly, it's not always easy to diagonalize large matrices that are square. You have seen this with David Lewitt's lecture. But there is a trick here that has been found by Dumitriu Edelman in 2002. It is that you can generate and sample very large random matrices in a three-diagonal form that you can easily diagonalize for millions of elements directly. Okay, so the main central feature of this random matrix, which is central stuff from which you get many results, is the joint probability of the distribution of eigenvalue. When you have this, you have a lot of things, both pictures and interpretation, and also analytical calculation that come in place. And here, for Gaussian ensemble, you can show explicitly that you can compute the joint probability distribution of the lambdas in this form. So you recover a Gaussian factor, which is not surprising from the trace of h square, and an extra here, Vandermonde determinant to the power beta that we are going to explain later. But here, what I would like to stress is that it gives for you a nice Coulomb gas intuitive picture interpretation of the eigenvalues. Consider that these lambda are actually position of some particles. Then you can understand this as a Boltzmann probability to some potential V of this lambda. If you just rescale the particle position, you can do that because you see that there's no scale in the log here that you will put in the exponential. You can put beta n square in front of the potential, and then the potential comprises two terms, a confinement, which is harmonic here, and an interaction, which is like Coulomb repulsion in 2D, which is logarithmic. So you see that these eigenvalues actually are like particles that are confined into a well potential, but subjected to a strong repulsion. And basically, the statistics coming from this is a balance between these two effects. And in the thermodynamical limit, when n is very large, you see that all this ensemble, independently of beta, should converge somehow to the same distribution of particles. They will not have the same correlation, but the same distribution at least of this confinement. And for those who know a bit of quantum gases, it's very qualitatively reminiscent of having bosons strongly interacting in an harmonic well. So what you get for the local density is a so-called Wigner-Fermi circle law, which is called in the Thomas Fermi limit in quantum gases physics. So what can we say about this law? I'm not going to prove it, but when n is very large, you try basically to fit the potential, and when n is finite, you can have some kind of finite temperature effect and finite number of particle effect. So first on the right-hand side, when n is very large, you see that the semicircle law works pretty well with what you get from the numerics. And when you have a smaller n, you see there is an effect of the beta because you are at finite temperature. So it goes a bit away from the limit of semicircle. So you have a bit of dispersion, like a thermal expansion here around the edges. And in the middle, if you have 8 eigenvalues, you can see 8 bumps corresponding actually to 8 particles that are strongly repelling each other. So it works pretty nicely, this interpretation, which is very physical. Okay, and the larger the beta, the larger the interaction for given n. So you see that GSE has the larger bumps compared to the two others. And this you can already see on a small notebook. Now I would like to take some time to do some calculation using what Wigner did on 2x2 matrix. So if I have time, maybe I will be a bit quick on some parts, but I'd like to do the following thing. First, show that if you require both rotational invariance and independent distributed variable, you get Gaussian. Then compute the joint probability for eigenvalues of a 2x2 matrix, and then infer the Wigner surmise that we used at the beginning. Okay, so if there is any question on the slide, I can take some of them. Otherwise, I will switch to my paper to do some calculation. Okay, I'm just checking the time. So maybe what I will do first for the first part, not to lose too much time, I will show my notes directly, and I will of course give you my notes, the PDF of my notes. So let me just comment for this first time briefly on why is it Gaussian. So the idea here is to take the simplest situation. You take a GOE matrix, which is 2x2. So I have 3 independent variables, A, B, C. I just check here that when I compute trace of H square, I have the factor 2 difference in the Gaussians. And I require 2 things. First, that I have independently distributed variable. So I have 3 functions, FA, FB, and FC, that factorizes the density probability. And then I require that this law is invariant under orthogonal matrices of O2. These orthogonal matrices are simply rotation matrices, if I forget about the reflection. And in order to get a differential equation for my f function, this is what I want to determine, I will consider an infinitesimal rotation. And this is very simple. Then I have just 1 on the diagonal and theta minus theta off diagonally. And the inverse is just with the minus sign. So the idea is just to compute this by applying this law on the explicit application of the similarity transform. So I write explicitly the coefficient of h prime as a function of h, and I got this expression for the h prime coefficient. This is, of course, because I'm close to unity. Let me just check the focus. Okay, it's better then. I'm close to unity transformation, so I recover h plus some first order correction here. And when I use this now, I plug it the new variable of h prime, and then I just make an expansion. So first derivative, first order in terms of theta, I've got f prime, fb prime, fc prime. And then this triple product, I just collect the first order term in terms of theta, and I also factorize the f of A, f of B, and f of C, which is already on the left. When I do so, I recover rho of H times the factor here to first order in theta. And of course, if I want equality for all theta, I need to cancel this factor. So this gives me an equation relating all the derivatives of f of A, B, and C into the variable A, B, and C. So if I rewrite this condition in this form, okay, I have three variables, but I can actually separate the variable like you often do with partial differential equation. And I realize that the B variable, for instance, is written only as a function of things that are independent of B. So this must be a constant, and this constant, I call it 2 over sigma squared. And then I just put the B on the other side, I get this differential equation, I integrate it, it's just a Gaussian with variance sigma squared over 2. Okay? So then I've proven that the B element should be distributed under a Gaussian, and this is the off-diagonal element. Once I have this, I can also separate the A and B contribution by first writing this using the same constant here. So there I get the sigma 2, and I split the C and B constant such that this should be independent of the other variable. So I first integrate the C1. This gives me a linear time term in terms of C. I get a Gaussian with 2 sigma squared now, and the same for A. So you see how this follows directly from the two hypotheses. So in the end, what I get is that I can re-express this as a function of TRH of A squared, plus possibly a linear term, which was this constant of integration, but I can get rid of this by saying that I changed the origin of the energy. So this is not relevant. What is relevant is the strength of the Hamiltonian, which is corresponding to the second moment. Okay, of course, it's more difficult to show that for larger matrices, but the 2x2 matrix is kind of very instructive. So now I'd like to, are there any questions on this? Okay, if it's good for everyone, then I'm going to switch now to the joint probability distribution. So that's the second point, and maybe I'm going to do it a little bit slowly. So the idea is the following. I want to change variable from H to the variable of the lambda and also of the matrix O that diagonalizes the Hamiltonian. So in the 2x2 case, it's easy to get the eigenvalues. You know how to do that. And you get the following explicit expression relating the lambda to the variable of H with the square root of the discriminant that simplifies to this form. Okay? And now what you are saying is that you want to do the transformation of the joint probability distribution. So it means that you want to go from what you know, which is rho of H dH. Here, explicitly, on the small matrix, this is just this three-variable density into the same, but re-expressed in terms of the lambda and the O. And this will involve the determinant, the Jacobian, of changing variable from H to the lambda and the O. So here I put the Jacobian this way, and then my new variable are d lambda times do. Okay? So you need to compute both the new rho and both the Jacobian. Okay? So maybe start with the simple. rho of h, it's what? We have said that it's exponential of minus trace of h squared over some variance. Well, it's very easy to rewrite this in terms of the eigenvalues. This is just minus lambda 1 square plus lambda 2 squares. And of course, this is independent of the O matrices. So this is done, and we expect a Gaussian. What is more involved is the calculation of the Jacobian. For the Jacobian, we must express A as a function of the lambda, and here O is parameterized by theta only, and the same for B and C. So to do so, we just write the equation stating that O diagonalizes H, and this gives us a relation explicitly between the coefficient of H and the theta angle. So here, the cos and sin theta, I write it in a compact way with c theta, s theta. Then I have lambda 1, lambda 2, and lastly, c theta minus plus and cos theta. I spare you the detail of the calculation. There is absolutely no difficulty in doing so, and you obtain the following result. A is equal to cos square lambda 1 plus sine square lambda 2. B is equal to sine square lambda 1 plus cos square lambda 2. And C is equal to minus sine theta cos theta lambda 1 minus lambda 2. Okay? And then, what is the definition of the Jacobian matrix? It's the derivative of the initial basis into the target basis. So I decide to reorder ABC in ACB because you see that C is a bit different from the other. I mean, we'll see why. And then you can compute it explicitly. Maybe I put it once. And then you will know how to proceed with the calculation. So I've get some cosine, and the important thing is that on the last row, I systematically get a lambda 2 minus lambda 1 term coming from the derivative. So I write the last row, cos square theta minus sine square theta, lambda 1 minus lambda 2. And here the last two elements are just product of sine and cosine. Okay? So clearly, when you will compute the determinant of G, you will see that the last column will give you a factor which is lambda 2 minus lambda 1. Okay? And then you have something that depends only on theta. So you can look at the calculation, but actually the rest is equal to 1. So it's independent. This is not obvious, but it's independent of theta, so of the matrix O. And the important thing is that what we observe already in the general formula is that you have a lambda minus lambda 1 that appears in the distribution. So let me now summarize the result. You can, if you wish, integrate over theta. It will just give you a volume of integration. But in the end, what you get is the following. You get the joint probability distribution of two eigenvalues, which is a normalization factor times lambda 2 minus lambda 1 times the Gaussian. Lambda 1 square plus lambda 2 square divided by 2 sigma squared. And when you have this, you can compute whatever you want for the statistic of rho lambda 1 and rho lambda 2. So let me just make a quick comment about the difference in terms of the calculation if you take a fully complex matrices. So here we have assumed real coefficient for the Hamiltonian. But if you take H to be now a complex matrix, then you will have off-diagonal elements with an imaginary part. So you don't have only 3, but 4 variables, and this changes the result. I'm not doing the details, but you need to introduce some unitary matrix that is parameterized not by 1, but by 2 variables. And this will also make the difference. You have an angle, these are like Pauli matrices. You have angle theta, but also the angle phi. You know this from quantum mechanics. And the consequence is that for the real and imaginary part of the element, they are related to the two angles with some prefactor, which is the difference lambda 2 minus lambda 1. So blah, blah, blah. At some point, you will arrive to the Jacobian. And in the Jacobian, you realize that you will get some terms that involve both the derivative of b with respect to theta, but also with respect to phi. And that will be the same for d, etc. So you will have two columns with a global factor of lambda 2 minus lambda 1. And this will make, sorry, you have to yell if you don't see anything. This will make a global factor of lambda 2 minus lambda 1 square. And that's the big difference, okay, for the complex matrices. And more generally, this is where you see that the beta number appears. It appears as the power of this level repulsion term that prevents the probability of having lambda 1 equal to lambda 2 to be non-zero. Okay? So basically, there is a connection between this beta and the number of free variables that you have. Okay? So here we only have, in what I will discuss later, beta equal to 1 or 2. Okay. So now we start from this. I guess now you are convinced that this should be the probability distribution. And from this, we can very quickly derive the Wigner surmise. So we want to compute P of S, okay? And that was the success of the Wigner strategy. Well, this is easy. You just introduce the spacing. You have only two eigenvalues, so this is the difference. And if you want to make a change of variable, you also introduce the sum of the two, such that you can compute the reciprocal relation, and the Jacobian of this is just 1/2 if I'm not wrong. So it will not matter, it will just make a factor. So if I want now to have the joint probability of S and M, from which I will get the probability of having S, I make the change of variable within the row, and it's just there. So I see that maybe I will make a proportional 2 to get rid of the prefactor. I get some S à la beta here. And then in the Gaussian part, I just get the two squares with a plus and minus sign, which simplifies just this part into two separate contributions. 2s squared plus 2m squared. So the cross term disappears. and this will make the integration over little m easy. Okay? I just integrate over little m to get the marginal p tilde of s of the distribution. Okay? So I do that. And last, I get the following result. This p tilde of s is equal to a constant that I write c tilde, s à la beta exponential of minus s squared over 4 sigma squared. So of course, the result depends on the variance that I've chosen for the matrices, but this might be not universal when comparing to some Hamiltonian. So then the idea is to do a special kind of normalization. So of course, you want your distribution P of A's to be normalized to 1. That's just the normalization of probability. But here you're going to impose something else, which is the average is also fixed. This is the average of S, and you fix it to 1. This allows you to compare different spectrum with different average spacing. Okay? And when you do so, you get a form of P of S, which is a coefficient A beta to the power S beta, and it changes the power, the prefactor, in front of the S square. Okay? So you have two conditions. It fixes the two numbers A and B. I give you the numbers of A and B. It's mathematics. You can compute them. What is important is that you have S squared in the exponential and S à la beta in front of this. And also this idea of fixing S equal 1 will be reused later in the discussion. So qualitatively, how can we interpret this level repulsion? So the central part of the physics here is in this S à la beta. And basically, when you have a spacing, it is written as for GOE and GUE in the following way. This is just the discriminant of the 2x2 case, where you have d equal to 0 for GOE and d non-zero for GUE. So this looks like a vector, the norm of a vector x squared, which has different dimension. So x belongs to R2 for GOE, or x belongs to R3. And the idea is that if you want small values of S, you need to make all the components of X conspirate into setting the norm of X going to 0. And this is easier in 2 dimensions than in 3 dimensions because you have more variables. So somehow the repulsion will be higher in higher dimension. So you can put this argument into a slightly more formal way, but you can just take the message of the larger the dimension of X, the stronger the repulsion. So this is important in interpreting the data. I did not discuss the GSE ensemble, but you can do it, and there will be actually 5 components for the vector X, which makes it even harder. Okay, so that's for the Wigner surmise, and you have seen that it works pretty well with the random matrix. But this Wigner surmise was also compared to the Poisson limit. So I'm going just briefly to discuss the Poisson limit of P of S. In which you just assume that you have independent lambda 1, lambda 2, and you're just asking what is the spacing between these two when you draw the two independently. So it's a standard little reasoning for Poisson processes, but I'm just doing it again quickly. So you have this lambda I, like position, and S is the separation of the two. And you assume that you have a uniform density. So it just means that the average of the SI, sorry, here between, is just a constant, which is 1 over rho, the density of particle. And then you ask, what is the probability when you sit on lambda I, what is the probability to have some S? So first, the probability to have one lambda from this is just the density times d lambda. Sorry, d lambda. So the density is constant. Okay. And now, what is P of S ds? If you draw a little interval, you start from lambda. You will put the next one between lambda plus S and lambda plus S plus ds. And there's nothing in between. One eigenvalue, the other is there. And then you can just split the interval into small intervals of size S over little m, and say that in each interval, I have no particle, so the probability is just rho of lambda d lambda with a minus sign, and by the hypothesis, this is rho times S over m. And you repeat this for the m intervals, where there is no particle, and then for the last one, you say, yes, there is a particle. So this comes with the probability rho times ds. Sorry, it's badly written, but if you put everything together, it gives you 1 minus rho s over m to the power m times rho ds. So you take the limit of m going to infinity, it gives you an exponential of minus rho s times rho ds. And then, if you choose the same condition to fix the average density of 1, you get the Poisson prediction, which is simply an exponential of minus s, which was the orange curve on my slides. Okay? So you have two things to compare, the Poisson curve and here the Wigner surmise for different ensemble. And there you are done with 2x2 matrices, for which we already inferred a lot of physics and useful result. So what I'm going to do now is to go back to the slides, and I'm going to quickly discuss the general result for the joint probability, because we are going to need it for the P of R variable. Okay, and if there is any question, do not hesitate to turn on your microphone and to ask me. Okay, so far we are there. We have shown the Wigner surmise, which is this one, with this explicit coefficient if you do the mathematics. Now, next slide, I'm going to show the general form of the probability distribution. So we did it explicitly for 2x2 matrices, a bit quick, but it can be done more generally, and I will follow the book by Pierpaolo Vivo on this. So sorry for I think it's important because this is the core of the random matrix theory, and it's not so complicated. So even if it will be fast, I think this is pretty important and useful. And we have seen the 2x2 steps, so it will be.
So Guillaume, but the Wigner surmise is a guess that it's exact for the 2x2 case, okay? But for the n by n case, is not exact, is a guess, or?
That's the question, okay? Yes, it's a guess. It's a guess, and it's not exact. I'm going to discuss this on the P of R more explicitly, but this is perfectly true. It's a guess that works pretty well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So it's not exact. If you compare to large matrix, so of course, if you take 2 by 2 matrix, this is exact. Okay. If you take 3 by 3 matrix, there is a little difference. And if you take large n, actually, it's still pretty good. So it's up to a few percent of error. I'm going to discuss this in more detail for P of R, but this is important, okay? There are some techniques mathematically to compute the exact P of S for large n limit, but you don't have such a simple law. You can also extend the calculation to 3 by 3 matrices. So you can do a Wigner surmise for 3 by 3 matrices. You will have some F function and complicated stuff, but the formula works better than the one from the 2 by 2. So it's a compromise between simplicity and efficiency and precision, if you wish. So for most data, this is widely sufficient to interpret the data and say whether you are Poissonian or chaotic, if that's the goal.
And the fact that the level repulsion goes like S power beta is true for any n, no?
Okay, yes, and this is an important point. It's more related to the structure of the level repulsion, as I discussed qualitatively, and to the dimension of the independent variable. And this doesn't come necessarily with a Gaussian distribution of the elements and things like that. So this effect of level repulsion is expected to be more general than just this random matrix ensemble. But I have no deep proof for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so quickly, how to recover this on the GO case? What is the strategy? Is to go from, again, the row of H elements to the eigenvalue. And here, in the notation that I took from the book LNV, the lambda now, or the X, like position of particle. So sorry for that. I did not rewrite everything, but it's the same idea. So this is what we want to show. And to do this, we need the relation between the X and the H element, which is done through this diagonalization process. So if you write probability conservation, you will have the rewriting of the row in terms of the new variable and also the Jacobian. And the new element of volume, which has the same dimension as this, if you count variables. So actually, it works very simply by noticing two things. First, this part, the row part, since it's the trace of H square, it depends only on the X, the eigenvalues. This is obvious, and you get the Gaussian coefficient. So it's independent of O. Second point, which is less obvious, is that the Jacobian is also independent of O. So in the end, you are going to show that this is this Vandermonde determinant, which is independent of O. So when you take the marginal and get only the dependence in terms of x1, xn, by integrating over the O variable, since both rho and g do not depend on O, the integration over dO will get just a factor, which is a volume. Okay, when you get this. So in the end, you see that you just need to compute the Jacobian to get this expression. So how this is done quite generally, it's done by considering the variation of H with respect to, you need to differentiate H and this relation with the X variable. So you have this orthogonal matrix, and by playing a bit around, you can rewrite things in the following things. You have a triple product. So you have three terms with three different delta, and then you introduce a matrix which is anti-symmetric. It's a bit later. First, delta OT, just to rewrite things in terms of a way where you can rewrite your Hamiltonian into the transformation of some small variation of the Hamiltonian. So you have to introduce some O and some OT on the left. And by doing so, you introduce a matrix which is like what you have in wedge product, which is an anti-symmetric matrix delta omega. So the notation comes with the idea of the wedge product. So that the delta H rewrite as a delta hat H, since they both have a similarity transform, they will have the same determinant. So you can only focus on this delta hat H. It has two terms, the one with the delta omega anti-symmetric matrix and the one which is diagonal here. And it's a small number, so it's a differentiation. If you compute the Jacobian of this delta H onto this new variable, translating with the indices this relation into differentiation, you get two terms. The first one gives you this xj minus xi term times this coefficient, which are your variable, and the diagonal one will just give you the variable times the unity matrix. So it's quite simple, and already at this point, you see that the result will not depend on O. Indeed, for the Jacobian, you need to compute all the partial derivative, and they will not depend on the O element. So this term will give just some one coefficient per column, and here you will have one coefficient per column also with xj minus xi terms. So explicitly on the example of n equals 3 matrix, so it's a bit heavy because you have a lot of variable, but you see that typically you will get some terms with some 1 and some term with some difference in the x. And if you rearrange the rows and the column into a diagonal form, you will see that the product of all these guys will give you a van der Monde determinant. So this is a bit quick, but in the end, it's very important. And look at it again. All the reasoning is just independent of the rotational invariance argument. We have not here assumed any rotation invariance with respect to the O. We just took the O matrix that diagonalizes our Hamiltonian. So this is a bit more general than just the rotational invariant Gaussian ensemble. Okay, so now we have this, and we can trust this result to proceed. Okay, so we have this result, and first qualitative question, why does it work? So it's not obvious at all that random matrix should work when you take an Hamiltonian which is sparse and with a few coefficients that are at all not random. So it's a conjecture, so it's not obvious that it works, and it proves to work from some general qualitative argument that I'm going to give. First, the model is constructed to match accessible numerics or experimental data. So if you want to reproduce the level statistic, there is information in the level statistic, but you don't have information at the level of all correlation between the eigenvalues. So somehow, if you want to have simple observable, maybe a simple model should work. So this is the physical argument relevance. And if you push a bit on the correlation, maybe you will find more discrepancy. Then there is the more profound ergodicity of matrix ensemble argument, which is the following. For this Gaussian matrix, you have the ensemble average when you draw the matrices, but if you take a single very large random matrix, actually it is ergodic and it has the same statistical feature as the ensemble of matrices. So now if you pick up a very large Hamiltonian, which has no underlying block structure, what will happen is that it's likely to belong to the same universality class. It will be a single instance of, say, a Gaussian ensemble random matrix. So then it should have the same statistics, okay? So this is why the underlying block structure could prevent you from these statistics, but apart from this very special situation, any very large Hamiltonian should somehow belong to the Gaussian ensemble statistics. So this is not a proof, it's just a qualitative argument. Another argument which actually combines a bit of the two previous ones is the minimum knowledge principle, which is the typical argument from information theory in statistical physics, where you can show that if you require your matrix element, your matrix ensemble to maximize some entropy, like a Shannon entropy, defined in terms of the density rho of H, and you just put as the constraint the normalization of the density, and the Hamiltonian strength, which is the traits of H square, then the Gaussian ensemble are the one that maximizes the entropy. So in the end, you just say that if the little thing I know is only the strength of the Hamiltonian, then my result should be compatible with the most probable will be to be compatible with the Gaussian ensemble. Then there is also some qualitative physical argument, which is that the level repulsion argument is more general than the Gaussian ensemble. Also, it takes a clear analytical form in terms of Gaussian matrices. And there is also this Coulomb-Gas picture, which you can generalize easily by taking other kind of potential, which should correspond to other kind of ensemble. So somehow you understand that the Gaussian ensemble are the kind of fixed point around which you can navigate a little bit without changing too much some simple observable. And actually, it seems that it's a current active field of mathematics to discuss this universality of the statistical fluctuation. And this involves very deep mathematics that I absolutely not understand. But it's interesting to see that at least it tells you that the conjecture is not so trivial to show. Okay. Now, some more practical consideration. You are doing some exact diagonalization from David Louis' lecture. You have an Hamiltonian. If you have no disorder, you must use all possible symmetries in terms of lattice, spin, and particles. Why not? Because if you don't do so, you will have a block diagonal structure. And if you combine different eigenvalues from different blocks, they will look like Poisson statistics. So it's a standard error that I did several times. If you miss one of the simple symmetry, then you will get accidental Poisson degeneracy, which is non-physical. You need to do the statistics inside each of the block, and then possibly at the end, you can just combine the different blocks statistics to have some average. Of course, if you use some disorder Hamiltonian, then it's easier. You have no symmetry, and you can do also the disordered average. Of course, from the ergodicity argument, the larger the system, the better the statistics. And it's hard to get a large system, but you have the lecture by David Louis to help you with that. For the level statistics, usually you remove the edges of the spectrum. This is not something that I discuss much, but you have strong fluctuation also for the random matrices at the edges. And basically, you target to perform the statistics in the bulk of the spectrum. And apart from this level statistic, you can do a lot of analysis with your data. And Lea Santos will give you a lot more details on all the possible stuff that you can infer from diagonalizes a full matrix. You have the level statistics. I discussed the local one, which is this P of S of P of R, but you also have like a compressibility of the fluid of eigenvalue particles, which is called spectral rigidity. You can have spectral correlation. This is all done with the eigenvalues. And you also have the eigenvector statistics. And this will be discussed by Lea Santos this afternoon. So what I want to do in the remaining time is to discuss the motivation for P of R and how it works. So there is a practical problem that I'm going to show on my notes. And then we are going to see the solution of this problem. So I share again my written notes to discuss the unfolding of the spectrum. So usually when you have an actual spectrum, you don't have the requirement, sorry for the focus, you don't have the requirement for P of S that the average spacing is fixed to 1, which actually would correspond to uniform local density of states equal to 1. In real spectrum, the density of states, which is defined with Dirac exactly peaks in this form, is basically, in a coarse-grained version, a continuous function, which is a Gaussian or something more complicated. So you need to unfold this spectrum to ensure that everywhere in the spectrum, the average density is equal to 1 to be able to compare with Wigner-Surmais. So first, how can we construct a coarse-grained version? Where you do, as in statistical physics, you fix a small interval delta E much larger than the typical spacing, and you count the number of peaks. Here, in the definition, we have the 1 over n, so it stays here. And then, what is the local spacing in this range? Well, typically, this local spacing is related to the larger width of the range divided by the number of peaks that you have. And this is nothing but the inverse of the local density of state. Okay? So in reality, the spacing depends on the energy. And you want to get rid of this dependency. So how to do that? You do that by saying, I'm going to transform my lambda into some new variables L of I, such that the level spacing of the Li will be fixed to 1. So let's write this. I have the transform. I know that the two are very small to each other, so I take the first order derivative. I fixed the average of the Li to be 1, and this gives me that the local spacing, which is related to the density of state, should compensate my f prime function. So this gives me the rule to get my f prime function. I must take.
What is the function f? I lost.
Sorry, maybe it was a bit fast. So I decide to introduce some function f that I don't know.
Okay, so you want to define the function.
I want the function f such that it fixes the average spacing between the new variables.
Okay.
So I fix f by requiring this to be equal to 1. This gives me a differential equation that f prime is actually equal to n times rho. I just integrate now the f prime, and this gives me f of e. This is the coarse-grained integrated density of state here of rho. So this is the rule. In the end, if I construct my Li in this way, I know that the average spacing for the Li will be equal to 1, and I can compare this with the Wigner surmise. So this is called the unfolding procedure, and it relies on computing this phi of c function, which is not easy in practical situation. So let me show you some example. Just keep this in mind. I need to compute this integrated density of state. Okay? And now, in reality, it can be nasty. Why that? Because if you take a non-disordered Hamiltonian like this, you don't have so many choice. You have just a single Hamiltonian. And the density of state may be nice if you're in the superfluid regime of this model where you have boson, kinetic energy, and interaction which are local. For U very small, you have free boson, so you have something that looks like a Gaussian, which is deformed by the U, but somehow this is very smooth, and you can guess that you can do the unfolding. But when U gets very large, you are dominated by the classical limit of the Hamiltonian. And here you understand pretty well that whenever you put a particle on top of each other, you will pay a U. And U is dominating, so you will get spikes around the U value that are a bit hidden by the kinetic energy term. But in the end, the density of state is kind of a nightmare to fit. You can do it with Gaussian, whatever you want. But if you want to do some unfolding with this is pretty annoying. So you're looking for another method than the P of S because of this unfolding. Yes, there is a question by Artem.
Yes. So my question is, I mean, why would you even expect that random matrix theory is applicable for such a large U over J? I mean, it's very close to a basically kind of integrable model, one might say, right?
Yes, we are going to see the result. I want to do the statistics. I'm not saying that it corresponds to random matrix theory. The idea is that you do the statistics, and whether your result is close to random matrix theory or close to Poisson, you say that it's chaotic or integrable. But at the level of doing the unfolding, it's not about the unfolding is not related to random matrices. You need to unfold the spectrum if you want to compare with Poisson, because Poisson also has the fixed mean density fixed to 1. Okay? So the question of the unfolding is not the question of only of comparing to or saying that it's comparable to random matrix theory. Okay? Okay, so it works, but it's a bit complicated, and this is P of S after a lot of work. So you see that for small u, it's non-integrable, and for large u, exactly as Artem said, it's actually closer to Poisson than to random matrix theory. So the problem of unfolding comes with the density of state, and actually it already occurs at the level of random matrix ensemble. The density of state is not constant for random matrix, it's a semicircle law. And if you are close to the edges of the circle law in this blue, you do the statistics and you don't find exactly a GOU because of this unfolding problem. While if you introduce this P of R, you see nicely that wherever you are in the spectrum, you have a nice probability distribution because we are going to see that it's independent of the local density of state. So this is just an illustration at the level of random matrices and not at the level of complicated Hamiltonian. So we want to apply this P of R rule. If you do that without the analytical prediction, it's a useful tool. And for the Boson-Baird model, there are two limits that are typical, free bosons and classical limit when u is equal to infinity. And when you do the average of the R value, you have a prediction from Poisson, which is the green line, a prediction from GOE, which is the red line, and you see that you are attracted by the two integrable limit case on the edges, and in the bulk, you have a nicely chaotic system. And what is interesting is to say that when you are not exactly at the edges, what is happening, and you need to do some scaling with the size for that. And you nicely see that a small u here takes you away from Poisson towards the GOE. When you increase the size, this is less obvious for very large u. So in the end, this is compatible with this picture of single point integrable situation. But you see a lot of finite size effect close to this point when you are finite size matrix. So last thing, and maybe I'm going to show it or I will distribute the notes, is we want to compute this P of R and to have the analytics like a Wigner surmise for this P of R. So how do we do that? I'm going to show you on the notes. So first, some general consideration, and then the explicit calculation. So the idea is the following. It's very simple. When you take the ratio of the two spacing, since on average the two spacing depend on the same local density of state because they are neighboring, then the local density of state will simply cancel. So then it's clear that the R variable do not require any unfolding, and you can directly plug in whatever energy you have into this formula to have the statistic and use the whole spectrum. So this is pretty nice. There is just a little difference in what I'm using here with respect to the original paper by Oganessian and Hughes, because I use this variable, which take the mean over the max, which correspond actually to this R or 1 over R variable. And the reason is the following. The R variable here, if S is very small, can go up to infinity, while R tilde is restricted to 0 and 1. Since you have the mean over the max, it's between 0 and 1. And this is useful for Poisson because we are going to see that for Poisson, the average of R is infinite actually, while the average of R tilde is finite. So since your observable at the end is usually the average, it's better to use practically this R tilde, but for the analytics, it will be easier to use this variable, okay? In the end, the two distributions, the one of P of R tilde and the one of P of R, are just the same up to a factor 2 in the range between 0 and 1. Okay, so now how do we prove the Wigner surmise for this P of R distribution? So first, some general consideration. If you have now the joint probability distribution of two consecutive spacing for arbitrary large matrice and random matrice, you can find that it's symmetrical, and this is rather intuitive, between exchanging S1 and S2. And this has already some profound consequence on P of R. Indeed, how can I write P of R? If I know this P of S1 and S2, it's simply to put a delta to take out the observable here. And when I make the change over the delta function and the change of variable, what do I find? I find that I can rewrite inside the integral the variable as S prime over R, S prime, and exchange the two at the cost of taking out a 1 over R factor. So in the end, P of R should be equal to 1 over S squared P of 1 over R. And this is something that you must check whatever result you have. Okay, so it's a consistency relation, and it has some consequences on the asymptotic behavior. Indeed, we expect that for small si plus 1 and small r, then P of R should have the level repulsion property of being to the power beta. Then, from this relation, you get that the asymptotic of P of R should be not an exponential, but a power law of power minus 2 minus beta. So this is general. Now, how to get a Wigner surmise? First, you need 3 variables, and maybe we are going to do the Poisson first. So Poisson is rather easy. You have 2 spacing. The spacing are independent, so it's product of 2 exponential. You do the calculation, it gives you this result. Okay, so you will get the detail. What is more important is the result for a beta ensemble. So to get a surmise, you need 3 at least eigenvalues. So what you are going to take is simply to take the density with 3 eigenvalues that you got from the general formula with the power beta and the Gaussian and the Vandermonde determinant. And then it's about doing the integration in a smart way. So you assume some order between the eigenvalues, and the ratio is defined from these 3 eigenvalues. The general way to compute the P of R is to integrate over all variables and fixing with a delta function the observable to this variable, this R variable to the other variable, and using the weight coming from this row. The only thing you have to be a bit careful is that with this, the boundary of lambda 1 and lambda 2 are defined by, of lambda 1 and lambda 3 are defined by lambda 2. Okay, so the last integration, or the integration, the last one is over lambda 2. When you have this, then it's a matter of doing change of variable and smart integration. And at the end, it's surprising, but it works implicitly simply. So first, you introduce the spacing x and y with respect to lambda 2 to rewrite this in this form. And then you have to work out the form of the row. And this is crucial because it kind of splits miraculously, or not. So this row now, as a function of the x and the y, has the variable lambda. And we want to separate the contribution from the x and y to the lambda. So this works nicely for the Jacobian because of the spacing, and then you have the exponential part. But since it's an exponential of quadratic term, you can always get rid of this quadratic term and separate the lambda contribution to the x and y. So this is why it works. The quadratic term here can be rewritten into a part that depends only on x and y, and a part which is a Gaussian centered on x and y, but when you integrate over lambda, it's a power 2, so you don't care about where the Gaussian is centered. Okay, so there is this splitting where you have the Gaussian, which here will very simplify the integration over lambda. And then you are left, this will give a number, and you are left with only the dependence in x and y. But this is, again, very simple because you will have this constraint from the delta function, which will say basically that y should be equal to x times r. So this is what we see, next. Thanks to the delta function, you can get rid of the y variable here and get a simple integral over x only. And this integral is very easy to get. You have a power law times an exponential, so it's sort of a gamma function up to a change of factor. And you do this change of variable, where the a here is dependent of the little r value, but in the end, you just take out the prefactor, and then you have a number that you don't care, it will come into the normalization factor at the end. So just looking at the factors that come out of the integral here, you get the r plus r square a la beta from here, and the 1 plus r square to this power coming from the what was here in the exponential. So this form is not obvious because there is a little bit of algebra, okay? But in the end, the calculation is not so difficult, and miraculously, it works pretty well. And actually, this works quantitatively well with many observations that I'm going to discuss. Okay, so yes, I'm going to finish with my slide, and I think I'll be done because it's time to stop. So now we have this surmise, and we are going to test it and see how good it is if we want to push a bit the numerics. So already on this curve, you see the surmise in full line, and the dots are average over large random matrices. And you see the agreement is pretty good. If you want to look at the error, you can say that the infinite n limit for very large matrices is equal to this surmise plus an error. And this error can be fitted from general consideration, basically the requirement of the functional relation that I gave at the beginning, and also the asymptotics. This fixes the kind of fit you must have. And since you require this contribution of the fit to be 0 when you integrate between 0 and infinity to keep the normalization of P of R and P of W, you are left with only a single parameter fit. So this is very nice, and this is an amplitude. So basically, the functional form is this one, and you just fix the amplitude. And you see that the error, delta P, that you obtain between the difference of PV and P is nicely fitted from this functional form, so you get a lot of precision now. And you see that the error is about 1% here, depending on the ensemble you take. And from this fit, you get a very precise estimate of the average of R for large matrices with a lot of digits, which is not required for actual precision, but for fun, it was useful to have this. Second, you can look at how you converge onto the n equal infinite result by looking at the error as a function of the size of the matrix. So basically, the amplitude of the error is given by this C of n, and you see that it goes to 0 when n is very large, and it's never too large, say, in between. So basically, it means that the surmise works for many matrices between 3 and large matrices. Okay. Last slide is just for your information to tell you that when you're doing level statistics, there is not only this Poisson or random matrix theory surmise. You can also have many different ansatz. One of it is useful, and Lea Santos will talk about it. It's a Brody distribution that interpolates between Poisson and GOE. You take beta as a free parameter. If it's 0, you recover Poisson. If it's non-zero, if it's equal to 1, you recover GOE. So you can look at the transition between Poisson and GOE by fitting the beta exponent here. This was for P of S. There is a kind of generalization for P of R, which I found in this paper by Korps and Reliano, and which is nice, where here again, beta is a fitting parameter that interpolates between the Poisson and the GOE ensemble, actually, even for larger beta than 1. Lastly, you can have a distribution that combine both the level repulsion at small s and the exponential tail instead of Gaussian. These are called semi-Poisson law, and they were introduced in the context of Anderson law derivation. And for this, you can also compute analytically the P of S and the P of R. That's all, folks. And here is my conclusion. If you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them. And you see that GOE works quite dramatically well for many situations.
Okay, thank you very much, Guillaume. There is already a question by Juan. Maybe Juan, you can ask the question yourself.
Yeah, sure. So in the plot where you show the amplitude of this correction, so there's a value where Cn becomes 0. Is there anything particular on the size of the matrix? Or
when it's close to 0 here,
yeah,
this is for n equals 4 actually.
okay.
So the first, n equals 3. No.
Is that just a pure coincidence, or that comes also from
it's a pure coincidence. I have absolutely no explanation. So for n equals 3, the Wigner surmise is exact. And what the black curve is showing, the difference between the Wigner surmise, P3, and the infinite limit result. Okay?
Okay.
So actually, the black curve is the same as this one in green, but just with a minus sign. It's reversed. Okay?
Okay.
So the next one is n equals 4, and you see that's the violet, and it's very small.
Yes.
And then, so you see it by you change sign, and by changing sign you cross 0, and then and this curve I have absolutely no intuition for that. We have an intuition for the asymptotic, which is the blue line and which is explained in the paper from exact method, and somehow you have to, when you change side from the Wigner surmise to the other side on the other side, you need to cross 0. But apart from that, I have no explanation why the n equals 4 works quantitatively better than other. What I can tell you is that actually, if you want precision, there is an exact analytical formula for n equals 4 in the paper that I cite by colleagues, in particular Pier Paolo Vivo. They have an analytical expression which is nasty, but which is exact for n equals 4.
Okay. Thank you. Is this observation similar also for GOE? So this zero crossing, or?
It's the same behavior. Here I show it for GUE, but you can do the same for GOE.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, Guillaume, there is another question on the chat about now the real model, I mean, not real, I mean, like the transverse field Ising model. At which size do you start to see the difference between GOE and Poisson? For example, is L equal 12 enough?
Oh, okay. I would say that it's physics dependent. So a basic rule is that if you want ergodicity, and it depends also whether you are averaging or not on disordered model. I don't know about the Ising model, the transverse Ising model. I did not do it myself, so I cannot answer precisely for this model. But for other model, it is clear that the larger the system, the better the statistics, both just for the number of eigenvalues you get, but also for the ergodicity argument, that the larger the matrix, the larger your you would go into the Gaussian ensemble limit. So I would say there is no rule, but basically what I can show you here is that for small model, L equal 8, the total Hilbert space, so the number of eigenvalue maybe was about a few 10,000. And for L equal 12, it was a million that you split with the symmetries. The statistic was done on a million. And clearly the statistic was better for the larger system. So somehow in the scaling, the larger systems are more reliable than the smaller one. So you somehow must not be too biased by the small sizes. The larger the size, the better. I would say that a few hundred of thousand to a million would be the best. So if you have only symmetries and no disorder average, then clearly you need 100,000, and then you have block symmetries to have different blocks. In each block, it's typically 10,000 of eigenvalue, the best you can do. And David Witz was able to do larger, but say typically. If you have disordered average, then somehow it helps because you average over the disorder in the Hamiltonian, and you are
Nicolas,
statistic from the disorder.
I think Nicolas wants to make a point about
yes,
the
maybe Nicolas
applicability of the transverse.
On this.
Okay.
No. That was just a comment I just wrote in the chat that if Prane, you're talking about one-dimensional transverse field model, this is integrable by free fermion. So you will always get Poisson statistics in that case. But I have actually, I raised my hand because I have a question. Can you go to this slide where you talk about intermediate statistics? So this is maybe not the last, but
yes, it's
the
the
one
last.
with Leah, I think. Leah
exactly. So here, okay, so is it a sort of a trick to be able to fit some intermediate or crossover regimes, or does it have some more physical meaning? For example, this semi-Poisson or this interpolation between GOE and Poisson. Can you comment on that?
I'm not a full expert on level statistics at this level, but what I can say is that if you look at the review by Brody, there was an old argument by Wigner, which was to say, remember the small Poisson argument of level spacing, from which you derive the Poisson law. You can actually improve a bit the argument by introducing a dependence on S in the density. So instead of putting a uniform density rho for independent variable, you just say that actually the density has a little bit of repulsion. So the probability increase with S. So instead of rho, you put rho times S, or a constant times S. And then you can solve the differential equation you get. And what you get is that the prefactor is an integral of this S, or just the S. And in the exponential, you get the integral, the primitive of the prefactor. So somehow, this form is a bit rooted from this argument. I was not there when they invented it, but somehow it's connected to this argument, where you have a connection between the level repulsion and what is inside the exponential. Okay, and clearly this is a beta plus 1, so this is the prime of this. So this is a bit of a probability qualitative argument, but actually random matrix theory tell you that probability arguments are not sufficient to understand the statistics. You could say that you can have a probability argument to define P of S, but it doesn't work. It works if you derive the P of S from a joint probability distribution, which is much more involved. Okay, because there is actually strong correlation between the eigenvalues. So this form has the advantage of doing the interpolation. It is rooted by this probability argument, and maybe practically it turns out to work well. But it's more like always, it's more like a conjecture, and I don't know whether there is some deep argument for that. For the semi-Poisson statistic, I think there are deeper arguments for that, but I'm not sure what is the status. To me, all these laws are very phenomenologic. It's a model, simple model, simple or not, but it's a model which is mathematically extractable and which is pretty useful because you can follow the transition, but it doesn't give any interpretation of the transition itself to the least I know. Okay, maybe Leah will be much more reliable in terms of answering this kind of question this afternoon. So consider my lecture as an introduction to Leah's lecture.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question by Jean-Yves.
Hi, yes. So you were mentioning if you have block diagonals matrix, then taking the statistics and making an average over different blocks. So when is it reasonable to do so? Because you can have models with Hilbert space fragmentation where you could potentially have integrable blocks and chaotic ones. So is there a general rule of when you can use this kind of grouping of statistics of the different blocks?
I mean, that's a very good question. So the situation is the following. When you have an Hamiltonian with no disorder, you have all these symmetries. And of course, you need to block diagonal them because it's obvious that you should work within each block. And now what you are saying is that when you have now a single block, you could have missed some other exact or approximate block diagonalization, which could be due from Hilbert space fragmentation or beta-ansatz, for instance, which has a lot of conserved quantities. And this is not what you do numerically, because numerically, you don't use the conserved quantity of beta-ansatz to diagonalize your matrix, but you see them from the Poisson law somehow. I have no answer how to get from the basic symmetries that you use from the numerics to the more physical interpretation of underlying block symmetry mechanism that I mentioned. And for this, I think it's a bit, understanding this is a bit understanding MBL, for instance. So I would say that here it's a tool, okay? And it will give what it gives, but understanding the output of the tool requires some refinement in the interpretation. I don't think that beyond giving the P of S that looks Poissonian, you have to look deeper at the correlation and at things like that, and the structure of the eigenvector and the correlation between the eigenvector and the eigenvalues to infer this possible Hilbert plate fragmentation. I cannot say better from that. At this level of interpretation, you don't have any interpretation for why you have Poisson.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. So I think, okay, the time is a good time. So if there are no questions, I thank you again, Guillaume. We can stop the recording.